The popular image of the Victorians is one of buttoned-up social manners and table legs covered in cloths, in case the menfolk became overexcited. But there was far more lurking under the surface of Victorian society than the history books would have you think. For a culture that was so strong on good morals, the Victorians were very interested in what people got up to in private. Join us today as we look at what sex was like in the Victorian era. People of the Victorian era were all about being in charge of yourself. While women got the brunt of that mentality, men weren't exempt from it. People thought that if men weren't so focused on their sexual needs, they would have more time to work on being useful members of society. Masturbation was believed to be more dreadful than smallpox because it robbed the body of sperm, a carrier of vital energies. From this idea came the first anti-masturbation devices. For example, the Juggum penis is a device that was made to stop men from accidentally or on purpose self-pleasuring themselves. When worn at night, the ring's teeth would dig into any sudden erections. This would wake the wearer up and make him want to get himself together instead of going through with any nocturnal emissions. When people of the Victorian era did end up getting down, there were a lot of rules attached. One of those rules states that unless a couple climaxed at the same time, then it should be considered a failure. In fact, women had every right to refuse to do it if they and their husbands couldn't get the orgasm of the woman, and the ejaculation of the man's sperm at the same instant. This idea stuck around into the 20th century. It was written about in books like The Hygiene of Marriage, which came out in 1923. In the past, prostitution was a job like any other. But during the Victorian era, it went against the social norms that were popular at the time. It wasn't just because of sexual activity. Prostitutes also stood for freedom for women from the patriarchy. Prostitutes weren't tied to the family unit, so they had social and financial independence other women lacked. As a result, popular culture smeared prostitutes as fallen women, in an effort to shame them and discourage young women from following the same path. In the Victorian era, French biologist Eugene Beclard wrote a book called Beclard's Physiology, in which he offered some useful recommendations to his readers. One of his many assertions was that there was a series of methods that could prevent pregnancy. These methods included making a woman dance around the room immediately after sex and riding a horse the following day. Beclard made a number of assertions that, when viewed in retrospect, appear to be laughable, including the claims that it is impossible to become pregnant as a result of rape, and that the personalities of the partners in a relationship determine whether or not they are able to physically conceive children. In 1894, Ruth Smithers published a relationship guide. According to her, couples should have intercourse no more than 2 times a week. The wise bride will permit a maximum of 2 brief sexual experiences weekly, and as time goes by she should make every effort to reduce this frequency. Feigned illness, sleepiness, and headaches are among her best friends in this matter. By the second half of the 19th century, there was a commonly held view that men were biologically inclined to hypersexuality due to biological imperatives, and as a result, they could not be held responsible for sleeping with a large number of women. Those who disagreed with this view, the most of whom were women, began a social purity campaign with the intention of putting an end to the double standard that was advantageous to men. However, rather than making an effort to provide women with the same liberties that males were granted, the campaign opposed all forms of intimate contact. These individuals were known as the New Puritans at the time. The later years of the Victorian era saw an increase in publicly visible homosexuality, which had been frowned upon in the previous decades. For a while, there were no explicit legislation against the practice other than public indecency laws, which could easily be avoided. However, in 1885, all gay relations were made a criminal offense, even in private. This legislation led to the imprisonment of Oscar Wilde 11 years later. For women, sexual intercourse was a necessary step in the process of procreation, and to treat it as anything more than that would bring them down to lower classes. That meant they had to be vigilant in case their husbands started to get frisky. Sometimes, that meant taking drastic actions. In the book Sex Tips for Husbands and Wives, Ruth Smithers gave a vital piece of advice on the matter. If he attempts to kiss her on the lips, she should turn her head slightly so that the kiss falls harmlessly on her cheek instead. If he lifts her gown and attempts to kiss her any place else, she should quickly pull the gown back in place, spring from the bed, and announce that nature calls her to the toilet. Indeed, intimate relations in the 1800s was something to be avoided at all costs, and people found bizarre and creative ways to get around doing the horizontal mambo. Thank you for watching. If you find this video interesting, please support our channel by subscribing.